All right, let's talk about one of the most fundamental ideas in American government. It's this constant tug-of-war for power, this push and pull between the national government in Washington, D.C. and the 50 state governments. It's a system called federalism, and honestly, if you want to understand American politics, you've got to understand this.
So, let's dive right in. To really get a handle on this, we first need to appreciate just how many layers of government we're even talking about. I mean, just think about it for a second. If you're living in the United States, I guarantee the answer is more than one. You've got your city or your town, probably a county, definitely your state, and then, of course, the big one, the national government. And this whole multi-layered system, it wasn't an accident. It was a very, very deliberate choice.
Now here's what's so fascinating. You have to remember the problem the framers of the Constitution were trying to solve. They had just seen the Articles of Confederation, their first attempt at a government, totally fail because it was just too weak. So they knew they needed something stronger. But they were absolutely terrified of creating a central power so strong that it would just become another king. So their solution was this radical, new experiment in sharing power.
So, how do you solve a dilemma like that? Well, the answer they came up with is federalism. And to explain it, we're going to use what might seem like a weird analogy, but trust me, it works. Cake.
So, at its core, federalism is just a system where you have multiple layers of government. For the U.S., that's mainly the national or federal government and the state governments. And here's the key. They both have authority over the same people in the same place at the same time. You know this, right? You pay both federal and state taxes. You have to follow both federal and state laws.
The original idea was something political scientists call layer cake federalism. Nice and neat. You've got the federal layer, you've got the state layer, and their jobs are totally separate. But over the last 200-something years, what we've really ended up with is more of a marble cake. The powers, the money, the responsibilities, they've all been mixed and swirled together, which makes for a much more complicated and, often messy relationship.
So what did that original layer cake recipe even look like? Well, for that, we have to go back to the blueprint itself, the U.S. Constitution. It actually tries to lay out who gets to do what. This table breaks it down perfectly. Over on the left, you've got powers that only the federal government has. I mean, could you imagine if Texas could declare war on Mexico? It would be total chaos. So only the feds can do that, or print money. Then on the far right, you've got powers left just to the states, like running elections, and yep, that includes federal elections, and setting up local governments. And that column in the middle, that's the marble cake part. These are concurrent powers that both levels of government can do, like taxing you, borrowing money, and setting up courts.
But the Constitution didn't just split power between the top and the bottom. It also had to set some ground rules for how all the states would get along with each other, to make sure they actually acted like one country.
And this is where Article 4 comes in, because it lays out some really crucial ideas. The full faith and credit clause, that's just a fancy way of saying your driver's license from Florida is still good in Montana, or that a marriage certificate is valid everywhere. The Privileges and Immunities Clause means that California can't treat you like a second-class citizen just because you moved there from Arizona. And the Guarantee Clause is basically a promise from the feds to make sure no state goes rogue and tries to become a monarchy or something.
So that was the plan, a neat, orderly system. But like we said, that layer cake got marbled up pretty quick. So how did that happen? Well, the federal government has some very, very powerful tools it uses to influence the states.
Over the years, the federal government really developed three main levers to, let's say, encourage states to go along with national policies, even in areas the states traditionally controlled. It all comes down to money, mandates, and one very important clause in the Constitution.
The first lever is just good old-fashioned money, specifically something called categorical grants. This is when the federal government gives cash to the states, but it comes with a big catch. They say, here's the money, but you can only use it for this one thing, and you have to follow our rules. The WIC nutrition program is a perfect example. The feds provided money, but they also set the exact income rules that every single state has to follow.
Okay, the second lever is even more powerful. It's the mandate. This is where things get really interesting. The federal government will tie the funding for one program to a state doing something completely different. It's basically the government making an offer that's very, very hard to refuse.
And this is the all-time classic example. Now, think about it. Setting a drinking age is a state power. But back in 1984, the federal government said, hey, states, if you don't raise your drinking age to 21, we are going to cut your federal highway funding. And for a while, Louisiana actually held out.
and famously their roads were terrible because of it. But eventually, every single state fell in line.
The third lever, and maybe the most powerful of all, is the Commerce Clause. The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce among the several states. Now that sounds pretty specific, right? But over time, that clause has been stretched to justify federal laws on, well, almost everything, from drug policy to civil rights, with the argument that pretty much all economic activity eventually crosses state lines.
But this isn't a one-way street. The states have pushed back, and sometimes they actually win. In a landmark case in 1995 called U.S. versus Lopez, the Supreme Court struck down a federal law that banned guns in schools. And the reasoning was simple. They basically said, whoa, hold on a second. Having a gun in a local school has nothing to do with interstate commerce. It was a huge signal from the court that the power of the Commerce Clause does, in fact, have limits.
So, we've waded through all this history, all this constitutional law. Why should you actually care? Well, because this tension, this constant fight over who has the power, is at the absolute center of the biggest political debates happening in the country right now.
Seriously, think about it. When we argue about healthcare, or education standards, or environmental rules, or whether marijuana should be legal, what we're really arguing about is federalism. We're debating which level of government should get to make the final call on these huge issues.
And that brings us right back to the fundamental question that federalism forces us to ask again and again and again. For any problem we face, who should decide? Should it be the national government, so we have one rule for everybody, or should it be your state government, which is closer to home and maybe understands local needs a little better? There's no easy answer.
And that's maybe the most important thing to remember. Federalism isn't some fixed definition in a textbook. This balance of power between the feds and the states is not a settled fact. It is a messy, dynamic, and never-ending negotiation that's been going on since 1787. And it touches almost every part of American life. It is the argument that sits at the very heart of American democracy.